morning, everybody. I'm Val Wolf. I'm an executive director at OHCOW, and I'm responsible for our workplace mental health, injury prevention, and migrant farm worker programs. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our 9th Mayday Symposium on workplace mental health and injury prevention. We chose the title of this event based on its timing, the timing and the title, because May 1st, as many of you know, is the International Labor Day, which was created starting back in 1889 and then kind of officially acclaimed or whatever in 1904. On this day, in recognition of the Haymarket strike and then subsequent riot and deaths of workers that had happened in 1886. And the reason for that strike actually was for the legal establishment of an 8-hour workday, which is something we still deal with now in terms of workload that people are faced with in many professions. So it's very appropriate that it's May 1st. We also use MaydayMayday because it is an internationally recognized distress signal, and workplace mental health and the stress that affects it is something that people need help from. And in fact, I was reminded this morning when looking at Wikipedia about the origin of Mayday Mayday that it's actually meant to be a short form of Vene Mayday, so come and help me. So very appropriate, I think, title for our event. And today I'm excited at our panel and our topic about integrating workplace mental health into occupational health and safety, as opposed to a marginalized, nice to have program. It really is important to be a core part of our occupational health and safety programs. And that's what we're going to talk about today. John's going to talk about the fundamental truth of that, and then we're going to see some examples from PSHSA in their programming and a case study. And then we're going to learn about the business safety portal from CCOHS, which integrates workplace mental health with occupational health resources. I'm just going to take a quick drink, and then I'll introduce John for the first talk. He's an occupational hygienist who's worked with the Hamilton Clinic of the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers since 1989. And in fact, today is his 36th anniversary with the organization. So happy anniversary, John.
Thank you.
And his educational background includes a Bachelor of Applied Science in Chemical Engineering, a Master's of Science in Health Research Methods. He was an assistant professor part-time at Mac's Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact from 2007 to 2019. And he's certified both with the Canadian Registration Board for Occupational Hygienists and the American Board of Industrial Hygiene. And he's been the OHCOW Workplace Mental Health Lead since forever, 2009, 2011, and that's from recognizing issues, health and safety issues that were impacted by the psychosocial factors going on in the workplace. So let's turn it over to John for his presentation on the fundamental truth: workplace mental health is occupational health. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Val. And thanks, everyone, and welcome. Okay, just a quick outline of what I'd like to talk about is why psychosocial aspects of work should be included as an integral part of health and safety. And secondly, why they sometimes are not included. So it's actually a top concern of Canadian workers. We put together a survey that we've done twice now, and the last time was in 2023, where we asked workers in Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia about their exposures. And we had almost 1,800 responses. And one of the questions we asked, or set of questions, asked whether any particular exposure they were experiencing caused concern, annoyance, or actually interfered with the ability to do the job. And we had 12 categories that we asked this question about. And when we looked at the frequencies, psychosocial hazards stand out like a sore thumb compared to all the other ones. The next closest ones being thermal comfort and ergonomics, noise, air quality, biological hazards. And when we looked at the comments, we also saw this is a word cloud based on all the comments from that survey, and stress was the most commonly used word, as you can see in this picture. When we broke it down by economic sectors, you can see that educational services had the worst score, and information and culture industries had the best. Now, this survey had small numbers when we break it down by sectors. For instance, wholesale trade only had 21 responses, and agriculture 24. And agriculture, I want to mention, because we have a migrant farm worker program, these are not the migrant farm workers that are tapped into the ECO's system for delivering surveys. Then we asked, how would you rate the psychological health and safety climate in your workplace, whether it be healthy, supportive, good, fair, neutral, not so good, poor, or toxic? And almost 75% were on the positive side, and about just under 20% on the negative side. And if we rearrange it a little bit, just over half were healthy and supportive and good. Just under 10% were poor or toxic, and about a third, just over a third, were in the middle there, fair and neutral, not so good. And we broke that down by economic sectors. Again, educational services was had the worst rating. And when you combine the two, you see that they line up quite well. And at the bottom 5, you have healthcare, manufacturing, mining, public administration, and educational services. On the top, you have wholesale, trade, construction, agriculture, information, and finance. Again, I caution that when you only have 21 or 24 responses in the whole sector, let alone even 100, they may not be representative. This was meant as just exploration. But the other thing, the reason to include psychosocial aspects in your health and safety program is that mental health costs a lot. I think you've probably heard about the $51 billion. This was back in 2008. That is the total cost of the mental health burden to the Canadian economy. And Martin Shane estimated that 10 to 25% of that 51 billion is occupational. And so he noted that $3 to $11 billion of these costs to society and the workplace could be prevented by changes in the workplace. So with a business case like that, what's stopping it? Well, the problem is most employers don't see it, maybe in their sickness and accident costs. And so it's often assumed to be just part of the background, cost of doing business. Obviously, there are other costs too to mental health issues in the workplace. It's the emotional burden, the pain and suffering, which you can't put a dollar amount to. Just the dread of going to work each day if you're going to a toxic workplace, the poor workplace morale, drain on productivity and innovation, absenteeism, presenteeism, and in extreme cases, contributing to suicide and even murder. I just was told about this by Dorothy Wigmore yesterday, and I thought this was quite interesting. In Europe, there's a pair of studies that looked at heart disease attributable to psychosocial risks, the population apportionable portion, and also suicide caused by work-related depression. And the combined was almost 11,000 people in Europe, compared to 3,200 or 3,300 that die of accidents. And so we just a few days ago, we remembered the people who die in the workplace from accidents, but also illnesses. And I'm wondering if we're remembering the heavy cost of psychosocial problems as well. Another reason to include mental health in your health and safety program is that it's part of the standard practice. In the Z1000 standard, Occupational Health and Safety Management, they list a number of hazards, and psychosocial hazards are one of the 6. Also, the ISO has a similar standard, 45001, Occupational Health and Safety Management Systems, and it also includes psychosocial as part of the hazard identification section of the standard. This standard is also now recognized as a CSA standard, so it's CSA Z45001. Then we have the specific standard Z1003, and it's called Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace, Prevention, Promotion, and Guidance to Staged Implementation. And it is currently under review. They're looking at it and how it will relate to the international standard. Now, this standard has 13 psychosocial factors, plus it has an extra one, any other factors that are identified by workers. And the CS or the ISO 45003 has a, which is quite expensive to buy, has 18 or 20, depending on how you count, for organizational and work group culture. They split it down into 3. Another reason is that it's legally mandated, and it's different in different provinces. And so I thought I would take a look at that. Let's start by looking at the work that Martin Shane did. He put out 3 documents, tracking the perfect legal storm, weathering the perfect legal storm, and getting ahead of the perfect legal storm. And he looked at 7 areas of law where employers are being held accountable for psychosocial conditions in the workplace that affect the mental health of the people in the workplace. Another person who did a lot of work on this is Catherine Lapel, who just passed away about a year ago, sadly. And she looked at the history of how work-related mental health problems were dealt with in compensation and health and safety law. And she came up with this pyramid where you start off with no policy, and then it's a civil responsibility and human rights issue and collective agreements. And then compensation for acute and chronic stress, usually acute first and chronic comes later. Then legislation on psychosocial harassment and violence. And that's about as far as we are in Ontario. In other countries, there's legislation for inspection of psychosocial conditions and risk assessment. And this is from a paper that was published in this book, Psychosocial Risks in Labor and Social Security Law, in 2017. So I thought I'd take a look at a few provinces, and Saskatchewan, for instance, in their Employment Act, which used to be called their Health and Safety Act, they include that health and safety means the promotion and maintenance of the highest degree of physical, mental, and social well-being of workers. So it's a very broad. And Saskatchewan claims that they were the first ones to include a presumption for all forms of psychological injury incurred through the work, not just for post-traumatic. Most provinces recognize traumatic events, but they claim. When I looked at the details, however, I found out that there's two criteria. One has to be that it's a traumatic event, and the other is that you're on this list, prescribed list of occupations where stress is recognized. And they have exclusions for typical normal part of employment and not considered a traumatic event, and this is common to many provinces. But at the bottom, they say, if a worker is involved in a series of workload or work-related interpersonal incidents that are beyond the normal expectations of maintaining employment, the incidents can be considered a traumatic event. So most provinces only limit the stress compensation to traumatic events, and so they got around this by saying non-traumatic events can be considered traumatic events for the purposes of compensation. Quebec is the only one who has a very clear statement where they combine physical and mental well-being throughout their health and safety laws and their compensation laws. So they make no distinction, and they don't have exclusions. And over and over again through their document, it's physical or psychological impairment for compensation. And as an example of an illness, they actually use depression as an example. I understand from talking to people experienced in the compensation world in Quebec that it is, however, rather difficult to get that. Nova Scotia recently changed their legislation to include gradual onset psychological injury. However, they still have a list of non-compensatable work-related events caused by labor relations. They have a special page where they devote to resources, and it's based on the CSA standard. The Ontario legislative context is we have legislation on violence and harassment. PTSD has been recognized as a work-related condition, and more recently, chronic stress has also been added. But there are no legal requirements to do a psychosocial risk assessment. This was based on a charter challenge. There was a case where a worker had exposure to continual harassment from a fellow worker for about 12 years. And previously, the Compensation Act expressly said that mental stress is not entitled. And even if it is an acute traumatic event, if it's related to employment, the regular relationships, then it's also not covered. And so there was a nurse in a hospital who was harassed for about 12 years by a doctor, and the WMH panel actually ruled that it was against her charter rights to deny compensation. And so the WSIB changed the law, and they added allowed chronic traumatic or chronic stress. However, it was still there was still an exclusion criteria for things related to regular employment. The Health and Safety Act, the when this change happened in the WSIB in 2017, the lawyers at the Ministry of Labor gave the opinion that mental health is not covered under the General Duty Clause. It does not fall under the protection of a worker. They also thought that the violence and harassment regulations may have overstepped its jurisdiction, and they said specifically for the purposes of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, PTSD, chronic mental stress, and traumatic mental stress are not occupational illnesses and do not trigger the notification requirements. And I'm not sure that this would withstand a charter challenge, but it hasn't been challenged to date. Now, when the ministry, or when the WSIB in Ontario first proposed their chronic mental stress policy, there were three aspects. You had to have a diagnosis that was consistent with the standard DSM diagnoses. You had to have an injuring process. It had to happen at work. And there was a causation standard. And at first, they first put out or proposed a significant contributing factor similar to any other occupational disease, but they soon changed that to the predominant cause. And this was to become in line with what was going on in BC. And so there is no entitlement for chronic mental stress caused by employers' decisions or actions that are part of employment function. And the Toronto Star, after a few years, looked at the rejection rate for claims, and they claimed that more than 90% of claims were being rejected. And so this article explored the reasons why. And if you look at the number of claims that were allowed in Ontario, you can see that there's just around 100 to 140 for the last few years per year. And they make up a very small proportion of the mental stress claims compared to traumatic mental stress and post-traumatic stress disorder are much larger. So the explanation for this was that 63% of ineligible claims involved employers' actions and were considered part of the regular work functions or interpersonal conflicts, and 37% did not meet the substantial threshold. In British Columbia, they had a similar situation where a work-related stressor, a chronic one, is considered significant when it is excessive in intensity or duration from that what is experienced under normal pressures and tensions of work. And interpersonal conflicts between workers or supervisors or customers are not generally considered significant unless they become threatening or abusive, and then it falls under bullying and harassment. And here's the stats for the BC psychological injury only claims, and about a third of claims are being allowed, so 2/3 are being denied. Now, a recent court case came out in March last month, and in this one, a worker in a school who was a carpenter and a lead hand was being bullied by one of the co-workers, and there's a whole list of abusive actions, and it was not disputed that the person was being bullied. The manager response was dismissive, ineffective, and left the person exposed to bullying and harassment. And he had a pre-existing panic disorder, and he experienced panic attacks almost daily until he finally went off work. In addition, he was also, his supervisor let him deal with some of the problems of the group, and so he was kind of the scapegoat, accepting the blame for the problems in the department. Now, the judge in this case said it was arbitrary. The labor relations exclusion section was arbitrary because it did not distinguish between an employer's actions that are taken in good faith and those that are not. And so he said that she, I'm not sure, they said an ineffective set of management decisions caused the disability. They said that the labor relations exclusion is arbitrary because it's unlimited and it should be read down, which means it should be more specified. When we looked at all the jurisdictions, there are a couple provinces that actually mention mental or psychological well-being or health in their Health and Safety Act. Quebec does not have any exclusions, whereas other provinces have exclusions, although Saskatchewan has a workaround in saying that if it's beyond normal expectation of stress, then you can consider it as a traumatic event. The one compensation board actually mentioned burnout, but it says that burnout from usual duties, workplace change, or performance standards are not allowed. So most provinces make the distinction, and I think that may change with the that BC decision. Now, Australia, it's been recognized as a compensable disorder for many years, and actually this was about 10-15 years ago, but it was at that time 11% of the total compensation claims for one of the provinces in Australia. The EU has recognized the Organization of Work and Social Relationships as part of health and safety since 1989. And since 1993, they've required employers to do psychosocial risk assessments. And this is also the case for many South American countries. So here in North America, we're actually quite unusual for not having any requirement to do risk assessments. And burnout syndrome is actually recognized in 9 countries in Europe, although the bar is set quite high in some of these countries, so there aren't many cases accepted. So now we'll talk about why it's not being fully integrated in occupational health and safety management systems, apart from the weak legal recognition that we just talked about. One of the problems is the words. Stress is both an exposure and a health effect. I can be exposed to stress at my work, but I can also feel stressed. And then there's good stress and bad stress. Psychological is what's going on between your ears. It's your mental life, your cognition, emotions, and motivation. Psychosocial has to do with the interaction between the social environment that you're working in and the psychological things that are going on in your mind. And mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well, and work well, and contribute to their community. That's the WHO definition. Whatever language or model or theory you choose will constrain your vocabulary when you're talking about mental health in the workplace. Talking about mental health in the workplace, it's worthy to mention the Bell Let's Talk program, which is focused on stigma and vulnerability. So you want to open up the workplace to have conversations about mental health. This is part of a larger discussion that especially took note during the pandemic of mental health issues. However, there are different perspectives. As I mentioned, psychology focuses on the individual and what they're thinking. And so if the problem is, if they have a problem, then the problem is between your ears. And then their solutions are also things that try to change your patterns of thinking. Psychosocial, on the other hand, not only recognizes what's going on in a person's mind, but what are going on in other people's minds in the context. So there's individual and collective responsibilities. So we've often used this framework, which we developed about prevention levels. It's similar to health and safety at the source, along the path, and at the worker, and in public health, primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. And what that means at tertiary level is helping people who have issues with therapy, counseling, medication support. Secondary prevention is trying to get it early. So you train people with symptoms on how to relax, mindfulness, that type of thing. Primary prevention is looking at resiliency, encouraging good coping and appraisal skills. But that's all at the individual level. We can also look at the organizational level. And at the tertiary level, we have recognition now that chronic stress is part of compensation. We have EAP programs, return to work. And then organizationally, we have awareness programs such as mental health first aid. However, the part of the puzzle that's often missing is looking at primary prevention at the organizational level. And this was first put together by a colleague of ours who drew it actually on Terry Semensky, who drew it on a napkin once. And we were quite taken by her scheme here. However, we did find that, just so you know, this active shooter, when we talk about stress amongst American workers, we often, in tertiary prevention, we have active shooter programs on what to do in case a shooter comes into the workplace. So you can see how they're very focused on tertiary prevention. And we found similar tables in a number of publications. And again, it said most stress management interventions occur at the level of an individual. Efforts to address the needs of the individual are less likely to succeed over time if stressful conditions in the workplace remain unaltered. So, and here's another one. It has long been established truth that interventions that directly target the reason for the problem are the best, as well as those that obtain the greatest effects by initiating interventions at the organizational level. A recent article just came out with a hierarchy of controls for psychosocial factors. And so it's at the top, the best, most effective is eliminate unhealthy working conditions, substitute, redesign the work environment, administrative controls, and at the bottom, it may be hard to see, but it says encourage personal change. And unlike the NIOSH hierarchy of controls, this is meant to include all levels, not just one. So you've heard the adage, when all you have is a hammer, all your problems look like nails. Well, this also applies to how you deal with mental health in the workplace. If it's stigma reduction, self-care, coping skills, mindfulness, cognitive behavior therapy, and resiliency, All those are at the bottom of the hierarchy. And we also need to think about the upper levels of the hierarchy. An example, Guarding Minds at Work was designed by psychologists from an insurance company to reduce the number of workplace stress-related sickness and accident claims. And Dan Blisker, one of the people who put this survey together, said at a conference of partners in prevention that the purpose of Guarding Minds at Work was to get cognitive behavioral therapy into the workplace. Mental health first aid is another example. Is the solution to a high rate of accidents to train more people in first aid? It's helpful, but it's not getting at the cause. So part of this is part of milieu in our culture, which is responsibilization. It's kind of downloading organizational responsibilities to the individual. The let's talk, be nice, stigma reduction focuses on the individual and on individual supports rather than on the work environment. So what we find when we're engaged with workplaces is that they can be at different levels. The early stage is just focused on violence and prevention, and regulatory compliance is the view. Then they start talking about mental health and try stigma reduction, but again, it's mostly focused on the individual. Once they expand it to the organization, then they start talking about risk assessment and management of psychosocial factors. And in places like Sweden and other Nordic countries, it's looked upon not as a risk assessment, but as an opportunity to grow the organization, a way to innovate and optimize conditions. Then we have the stages of change, and this is similar to the addiction problems, but it follows also with mental health in the workplace. The early stage is denial. Stress is just part of work, and that's all there is to it. Then there's the thought, well, maybe things could change. I'm not sure I'm ready to do it, but I'm thinking anyway. And then preparation. They're ready to do something. They actually make changes, and it's important once you make changes to make sure they stick. What are the drivers that get things done? And sometimes it's money or production, quality, WSIB or sickness and accident statistics, health and safety, risk management systems. We talked about some of these. And the one I like is the one that James Ham said in 1983, law is the conscience of those who have none. So just use your conscience. There's a confusion about how to do it. You should do it together, not alone. The myth of evidence-based interventions. You can have the best evidence-based intervention, but if people are not willing to change, the best system won't work. The worst system or a poor tool can work as long as people are motivated to do it. But it's not the tool, it's the commitment, and there are no silver bullets. And we've experienced that psychosocial interventions work well if an organization is motivated, and that's obvious. But it also works well in workplaces that are in a crisis. If they have a toxic workplace and something has to change. Where it doesn't work so well is in between, where people are interested but not as motivated. And we have some examples that you can click on to see stories of workplaces that have done this type of thing. And we also have a booklet to help. Sorry, I think I went a bit overtime. Okay, are there any regulations or rules in the United States? If there were, they probably won't be soon. Again, I've talked to workers at conferences in the States, and for them, they're dealing with the effects of stress in the workplace, like active shooters, suicide. I've heard stories of people committing suicide at the punch clock. Things are quite serious there, and they have very little legislation that will protect them, and they'll probably have less soon if it's not already. Let's see.
I'm here. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I WebEx quit, and then when I came back, I was muted like everyone else. So the other question that was earlier was about the definition of was it when you were showing the very earliest survey that at the beginning of the presentation, the question was a definition of psychological hazard or psychological health and safety provided to the survey participants in terms of then how they answered.
Yes, it was. I don't have it handy, but like for each one, there was an exposure, and then there were a whole bunch of lists. So it would be things like bullying, workload, relationships, things like that. I could look that up, but I don't know off the top of my head what I all included. I tried to be as inclusive as possible.
Okay, great, thanks. I think we better move on because yeah, we did, but there's always so much information to share, especially if people haven't heard it before. So we are posting the slides. I'll try to get them up this afternoon so people can get the links. John, if you have a newer version, send it over. But in the meantime, we'll switch now to Maddie. You want to pull up your slides?